Let's dive into today's presentation, Flowing Through History, Discovering Central New York's Water Heritage. Our speaker today I have the pleasure of introducing Dan Smith, who is head librarian of the local history and genealogy department at Central Library.
Well, thanks, Kate. Well, when Kate and I were looking for a topic for this month's history program, it seemed that water was making the news quite a bit this year with the floods in upstate New York and the water requirements in the news for the Micron project. So we thought we'd take a look at water in Syracuse and Central New York, not so much for its role in transportation, but for its historical role in daily life. Now, as far as the relation of water to Syracuse, you could say that Syracuse spent its first 50 years getting rid of water, and the next 50 years looking for water, or at least good quality water. That's the way that some of the early historians put it. Now, salty water or brine is what drew the first Europeans to the area. The French Jesuit missionaries wrote about the salt springs near Onondaga Lake in the mid-1600s, but it was another 100 years before permanent European settlers came to the area. Now, although the lake itself is only slightly salty, the springs surrounding the lake were one of the few places in early America that could produce salt away from the Atlantic coast regions. While the salt making opportunities brought the first entrepreneurs to the region, the surrounding topography really posed the greatest danger. Much of what became the city of Syracuse were wetlands, described by the early writers as a cedar bog, or what was not actually swampland, was fairly soft and damp, covered with hemlock, cedar, and tamarack trees. Now, with these conditions, the area also became known for bilious fever, or what we call today malaria, and other diseases that are associated with wet, humid, mosquito-infested locations. So as a result, most of the early settlers went to the highlands south of Syracuse, mainly Onondaga Hill and Onondaga Valley. Now, these areas grew first, and it looked early on like they would become the main settlement, with the major roads like the Seneca Turnpike and even the county courthouse located there. However, the lowland settlers persevered, and gradually the hamlets of Salina and Syracuse incorporated as villages by the mid-1820s. They were already becoming commercial and population centers, primarily because of the salt industry, as well as the opening of the Erie Canal. Now, in those years, the residents mostly relied on nearby streams or hand-dug wells for their water needs. Onondaga Creek also became a source for water and power. In 1805, there was a mill built on Onondaga Creek near Genesee Street, and a large mill pond filled what's now Armory Square. You can see in this map that mill pond even covered, caused Clinton Street to take a slight turn there from north-south, and the mill was located more northerly in the map near Genesee Street. This little later map shows the village of Salina in the north, and the area that was the city or the village of Syracuse at that time, with the Onondaga Creek meandering to the lake and a lot of marshland there just south of the lake. Now, both Salina and Syracuse had only a few hundred residents in the early 1820s, but by 1830, Syracuse had grown to more than 2,500, helped mostly by the location of the canal. By the time the Syracuse section of the canal was completed, there was an effort to reduce the size of the lake and reclaim that area just south of, on the south end of the lake. In 1823, they opened up the northern end of the lake. The channel was deepened and the lake lower level was lowered. So more land became dried out on the southern part. In this map, the dotted line in the middle of the screen there shows the original boundary of the lakeshore, and that's Hiawatha Boulevard going east and west on the map. Still, much of what became downtown was uneven, with so many hills and bogs that the road from Onondaga to Salina was considered almost impassable until after June, till it dried out. Now, even in those early years, the growing villages knew that they needed to find a reliable water source. There was a public pump located in Clinton Square and a stone well in Hanover Square, but those were the only two public facilities. Now, in those years, it wasn't unusual for governments to franchise private parties to construct and operate what we consider today municipal improvements. This was common with road building, like the corduroy and plank roads that were popular in those days, and in this case, also the water supply. Now, in 1829, the village of Syracuse conveyed the right to Oliver Teal to create and operate a public water system for the village. And he's considered by most to be the founder of the Syracuse water system. He was born in Connecticut in 1788, and he was the son of a Revolutionary War veteran who moved his family to Manlius in the 1790s. Oliver was really one of the early entrepreneurs, and he tried his hand at various businesses, including running a tannery and a lime kiln. He speculated in real estate and built quite a few water-powered mills. And during the War of 1812, he raised a company of soldiers to defend Oswego. And after that, it was known as Captain Teal. Now, with his building experience, he was given a contract to construct the middle section of the Erie Canal, and he served as superintendent of the Syracuse section for several years. He relocated to what was then called the village of Lodi. This is just east of downtown, roughly where Erie Boulevard today meets Lodi Street. That was its own small village in those years. And he built a house on what's now Beach Street near Erie Boulevard. Now, the house stood there until the early 1990s with some modifications, but you can see the original there. Now, he was quite a public-spirited individual. He opened a school and founded a savings bank, and he favored many of the reform movements that were popular in the day, including temperance and the abolition of imprisonment for debtors and the rights of married women to own property apart from their husbands. He became a vegetarian late in life, and Teal Ave, not far from his home, was named for him. Well, despite this, there really wasn't much movement in developing a water system, but some events during the 1830s really brought more attention to the issue. There was a cholera epidemic in 1832, and 2 years later, a fire wiped out the buildings along the canal between Salina and Warren Streets in the center of the village. So in 1841, Teal got approval to raise the rates he could charge for supplying water, and it justified really getting serious about building the system. You could charge $10 a year for individual homes and $40 a year for taverns. Now, the first pipeline was laid near the canal along Almond and Fayette Streets, primarily to serve as a water supply to fight fires in the village center. The pipes were actually bored out logs, and the line was soon extended from the canal area to a spring up by Gertrude Street and Hawley, and at the lower end of James Street Hill. There was a reservoir built to contain the water. Now, iron pipes didn't come into use until the 1850s, and these wind pipes still turn up occasionally when the DPW or construction crews are working in the downtown area. This is the first reservoir that was in use, and it was only 6 or 8 feet in diameter, and it was still visible in a backyard on Fountain Street until the early 1900s. Now, the villages of Salina and Syracuse merged in 1848 to form the city, and the population at that point was a little over 22,000. Syracuse finally got serious about cleaning up the nuisance ponds and bogs downtown, and they filled in the mill pond with dirt removed from Prospect Hill, where St. Joseph's Hospital is today. And the Syracuse Waterworks Company was incorporated year after that, and Albert Teal was president. But soon the demand for water outstripped the ability of those early springs to supply the needs for the new city. So springs were located at southwest of downtown on the area now that's Rainer Ave and Stolp Ave, and a reservoir was built near Crosset Ave, and this is a early photo of that reservoir. In the background is the city at that point. Now, Furnace Brook, which runs from Onondaga Community College through Elmwood Park, was piped downtown, and a reservoir was built in the 1860s near essentially where the OCC campus is today. And later years, that reservoir was known as Pogie Pond. Students of OCC prior to probably 1970 might recall that body of water up there, but that was originally the one of the city reservoirs to feed water into downtown. Now, Onondaga Creek also became a source of water officially in the 1870s, and a new pumping station was built about where Cortlandt Ave is, and that pumping station is in the background of the photo here. And a reservoir was constructed in the late 70s for the reservoir for feeding the city. It was named the Wilkinson Reservoir, and it's really probably the most visible remnant of the original system. This was one of the pumps that was in that pump house there. It was built in Western New York. This map shows that large reservoir in the center. That was the Wilkinson Reservoir, and the earlier reservoirs are visible here. This is near Crosset Street. The most visible survivor of this early system is Hiawatha Lake in Onondaga Park. You might recognize the bandstand, and so now it's a park area just southwest of downtown. Now, some of the other remnants of the early system became kind of attractive nuisances until they were drained and filled in. This 1902 article ran in newspapers across the state about the sea serpent that was spotted in the old reservoir. It says 300 people spent the greater part of last night at the old Crosset Reservoir watching for the sea serpent that has been seen there recently. Several of the youths had revolvers during the evening and shot many times into the water. Others kept large bonfires blazing on the bank. The sea serpent, however, did not appear. Well, the next few decades had Syracuse's population more than doubled, so that by 1890, there were close to 90,000 residents. However, during the 1870s and 80s, there was a growing dissatisfaction with the quality and supply of the water, both because of the taste and the bacterial levels in the water. Another factor was the lack of pressure in the system, not enough to feed the fire hydrants in many places. Well, around those same years, there were frequent outbreaks of typhoid fever. This article describes an outbreak up at the state school, near Burnett Park. There was a lot of agitation in the city to either change water companies or begin municipal ownership of the water system. In 1886, there was a public referendum for municipal ownership, but that was defeated. However, Mayor Kirk asked the state legislature for permission to form a panel of water commissioners to explore options for a new water source. And the commissioners looked at 11 possible water sources. Some of the choices were Onondaga Creek, which by that time was becoming kind of more polluted because of the population, the industries along the shore. They looked at Tully Lakes and Seneca River. They checked out Oneida Lake and Casanova Lake. They looked at Atisco and Skaneateles, and they even thought about Lake Ontario and the Salmon River. But after a lot of analysis, the commissioners settled on Skaneateles Lake as the best option, both based on its low bacteria content and organic matter, and the lack of high mineral content, which was important in those years that depended on steam power, and lack of minerals would keep the machinery running without buildup of scale in the mechanics of the systems. Now, in 1889, there was another referendum, and the Syracuse voters this time went more than 90% in favor of a city assuming control of the waterworks and choosing Skaneateles Lake as the water source. There was opposition from mill owners along Skaneateles Creek, and the State Canal Board objected too, because the lake was used to keep the canal level high during some parts of the year. But the real challenge was one of engineering, mainly because Skaneateles was 20 miles from Syracuse. Although the elevation of Skaneateles Lake is about 400 feet higher than Syracuse, the route crossed a lot of ravines and hills, and this diagram shows some of those variations in elevation between the lake on the left-hand side of the screen and Syracuse at the far right. The remarkable feature of the route that they plotted was, and the conduit that they built, is that it's entirely a gravity feed system from Skaneateles to Syracuse. It doesn't require pumping, at least to that point. The chief engineer on the project was William Hill, and he went on a few years later to oversee the New York City aqueduct system in the Croton Dam area. The pipeline from the placement of the intake pipe at the lake until the completion of the conduit took only 3 years and cost just under $4 million, and that's in 1894 dollars. So some of the challenges can be seen in these photos. This area is near Marcellus. Some of the sections they refer to as the Alps because of the topography and the digging that was required. Well, the new source of water deserved a new reservoir, and the Woodland Reservoir near Geddes Street was finished later that year, built with a lot of human and equine muscle power. This is a photo of its construction. They brought crews of African Americans from the South. Some of the contractors hired groups from there, and some of the it looks like some of the power was done by mule power too, and not just horsepower. That's the gatehouse that is at one end of the reservoir. They tried to make the reservoir a park-like setting. The area had been a picnic area before, and so they did try to retain a little bit of pastoral look to the location. Well, this later shot from probably the 1940s has a round building to the left there that's a standpipe that, as the city started building on the hillier areas, it required some pressure to keep the water levels to those higher locations. And that was, at that point, they had to install a standpipe. Now, after the city took over the old Syracuse Waterworks, you might think that once Skaneateles water began to flow, the problems would be solved. However, the old Waterworks company only had 2,700 customers in a city of now at this point roughly 95,000 around 1890. Still, most people were on privately owned wells and pumps, and the map shows the locations of the pipelines that existed, and the red lines are the pipelines and water mains, and you can see several locations and many streets didn't have pipelines in their vicinity. Now, a study done in the late 1880s found that there were nearly 1,400 private wells in use, and close to 1,000 of them were within 50 feet of an outhouse or privy. This photo shows the Genesee Street, the West Genesee Street area around 1912, and in the background there, that's the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. The buildings at the forefront are outhouses. So the outhouse was still very common even at the turn of the century. Now, around the same time, the purity of ice became a concern. Ice, of course, was vital in those years before mechanical refrigeration, both as for cooling and for food production. It was delivered to home by various ice vendors. The sources of the ice were the concern about safety. Casanova Lake was one of the better locations for drawing ice, but even there, this ad from the 1890s city directory shows that the ice was washed before leaving the ice house. The bottom of the ad. Something that was surprising to find was the popularity of bottled water back then. It was sold mostly to hotels and private homes, probably more well-to-do private homes. And some of it was bottled in Dorwin Springs in the valley, and some came from the Great Bear Springs in Fulton, like this particular bottle. Now, these were brought to homes by vendors too. Home delivery was, of course, very popular at that point. Well, we're lucky to have in the library collection the recollections of a native Syracusan who left us a very vivid description of daily life for a working family in a city neighborhood at the turn of the century. And he had a lot of details in his story, especially relating to water. Now, Fred Hearn was one of 7 children born to German immigrants on the north side in 1886. Now, at the age of 90 in 1977, Fred shared his memories with his son-in-law, who transcribed them into a book form and gave them a copy of that to the library. This is a photo of Butternut Street on the north side, not far from Fred's home. Some of the details in the photo you can see in the center there is the streetcar track, and it was electric streetcar. You can see the overhead wires, and there's phone wires, but you can see that the electrical wires and phone wires, none of them actually go to the houses. And the street itself is still, in those days, was unpaved. There's some cobblestone in probably in the center there, but it's still pretty much almost a dirt road. Fred included in his narrative a photo of his home on Kirkpatrick Street, and it's pretty typical of the houses found on the north and west sides of the city. His father purchased the home for $1,050 and had an annual mortgage payment of $50. Originally, it was built on posts, and later they dug a cellar and built a foundation under it. Now, this page from the 1892 Atlas gives you an idea of the open area on the north side, the fringe area of the city at that point. Fred's home is in the top section of this map, or just about where that word ST is, that those letters there. And to give you an orientation, that third North Street is Grant Boulevard today. Those streets that are marked St. Anthony and St. Francis were part of the Franciscan convent grounds, and that's where Grant Middle School is today. Now, Fred's home was pretty typical of the houses you can still see on the north and west sides of the city, almost cottages. At that time, of course, there were no gas or water lines to the city, to most homes and streets, and electricity was still a novelty. So Fred's family built a cistern under the kitchen to collect rainwater, and they placed a pump at the sink. And during the dry times, and they would have to supplement it with water brought in from another source. And in the winter, they'd have to melt some snow to keep the water level up. Now, Fred's father died when he was 7, and his widowed mother and several neighbors decided to find their own water supply. and they pooled their funds to drill a well and form their own informal water company. As Fred's family didn't have the funds to pay for their share, they offered their front yard for the well site, and they ended up having to drill down 116 feet to get a reliable water supply. Now, they bought a hand pump similar to this and built a platform and placed a lock on the pump. Members of the informal water association were given keys and paid monthly dues for maintaining the well and the pump. Of course, the water was still not piped into the house, and people had to come and fetch it. Fred describes how their home became kind of a social gathering place for the neighbors as they came to get their daily water supply. Well, just as there was no water service, there were no sewer or septic systems yet at that point, and the outhouse was still commonplace even as late as the teens. Sanitary sewers were often built later than the water mains, and Fred goes into detail on how these facilities were serviced. There was a dedicated business to clean out houses. These ads are from a city directory from the 1890s, offering cleaning of vaults and cesspools. So the function is something similar to a septic service today, and there were even specially built wagons with large buckets and cranes to help clean out the privies and outhouses, which Fred says had removable boards in the back, and it must have been a really rough job, to put it lightly, to have done that. Now, Fred was the youngest in the family, and he was often drafted to help with the laundry. And the wash tub doubled as a bathtub for the kids until they were too old to fit in it. There, of course, were no water heaters, and most cook stoves in those days had a water reservoir on the side for warming, along with the use of the kettle. This diagram shows the multifunction that could be found on the stoves of the day. It's definitely a versatile appliance, and even if it required high maintenance. Now, of course, homes had water pitchers and basins, and more modern homes would have had plumbing fixtures, but they were definitely not universal by that time. And it's what's interesting that privately operated bathhouses were quite popular in the late 1800s and even into the early 1900s. The fanciest of these was the La Concha, opened in 1886 downtown, just next to St. Mary's Church, or what's now the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception on Jefferson Street. This is an ad from one of the publications of the 1890s. Now, it was quite an elaborate facility. There were private baths in the basement, and a restaurant on the first floor, and apartments upstairs. You can see the cathedral just to the left, and the Concha is right in the center there. It closed in the early 1900s, and the building was torn down, and the space allowed the cathedral to expand. Now, Fred describes going to a much humbler facility by the salt yards near Spencer Street. These baths were promoted as much for health as for hygiene, stressing the benefits that could be had from the mineral water. But for Fred, it meant a 2-mile walk from Kirkpatrick Street, so he didn't take that trek lightly. The two of the last ones existing were the White Oak Springs. They're just north of Spencer Street, and to the bottom right of the map, the Chlorine Springs. This is a photo of Chlorine Springs. You can see in the background the solar drying vats of the salt industry, and the skyline of the north side of the city at that point. This is White Oak Springs. The bridge there is Spencer Street. White Oak Springs is just to the right of the photo, and the other buildings are the salt wells, wellheads, and pumping houses. Now, these facilities really came on hard times in the early 1900s, and although home plumbing was really becoming more common, the city thought it was important to purchase White Oak Springs, and they turned it into a public bath. So it was a municipal bathhouse, and that continued to have so much patronage that the city built a new facility for it in the 1930s, which is this building. It finally closed in 1963 and was still reported as having 3,000 visitors a year. The building is now the Parks and Recreation Office at the corner of Spencer and Maltby Streets. And Maltby was the name of the owner of the chlorine spring. So that name, a little bit of that mineral bath era endures. Well, as Fred entered the working world and earned enough money, the family eventually installed indoor plumbing, and he replaced the kerosene and gas lighting with electricity, and they installed a coal furnace. But Fred says that his mother still had reservations about the idea of having the privy in the house. Well, the Hearn home on Kirkpatrick Street remained in the family for about 80 years. And this is the house today on Kirkpatrick Street. And Fred grew up to serve in World War I, and he had a career as an accountant in Cleveland, Ohio, and passed away near his daughter's house in Delaware. And in 1987, at the age of 101, so it must be his early life, it didn't affect his longevity. Now, as far as Syracuse, the population of the city had grown to more than 180,000 by the mid-1920s. And these were years of expansion as the city added made the fringe areas for annexation to the city itself. This map shows the different dates of portions of the city being annexed, with the village in the center and the village of Salina just to the north, and then just to the right of the village would be the village of Lodi, and then those other sections were added later. In the 20s, the largest additions were Eastwood and the Valley. The water system was really a selling point for annexation, and one factor was that the city death rate dropped by almost 50%, from 20 deaths per thousand to less than 12 per thousand by 1900, and that was attributed mainly to the better water supply. Now, even the reports of the day promoted the availability of good water. And this is a picture of the fountain down in front of the public library on Montgomery Street. It says that there were 12 other fountains like this in the business section of Syracuse, which of course would only operate from early spring until late fall. Now, 2 more conduits were constructed from the lake, and additional reservoirs were built to serve the city needs, including the Westcott and Morningside reservoirs. Now, although today the EPA standards have required modifications to the reservoirs, and they have to have ultraviolet treatment of the water, Skaneateles Lake is still of such a quality that Syracuse's system is one of only 7 large city systems that isn't required to have filtration to meet the new standards. Now, after World War II, suburban communities really had a lot of expansion. The population of the outlying towns grew quite a bit. So like the early days of the city system, there was a mixture of private water companies and municipal systems that initially serviced the suburban and outlying towns. In 1951, the Onondaga County Water Authority, or ACWA, was created by the state to serve as a nonprofit corporation for the water needs of Onondaga County and the Central New York region. And it primarily drew from Otisco Lake when it began in the 1950s. Well, 10 years later, in the early 60s, the Metropolitan Water Board was formed to bring Lake Ontario water for use, mainly in the northern suburbs, and to supplement the city when it was necessary. This map shows a diagram of that pipeline that was made in the 60s to bring the Ontario water southward to the northern part of the county and to the city. Well, the water systems of Central New York have really come a long way since the days of buckets and dippers. I imagine one mark of success is when children choose your logo for a costume theme, and this girl is all set for Halloween. And I want to thank you for watching, and if there's questions, we can try to answer some of those. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Dan. Mark is asking if there's a group who likes to get together to study this and share info and history. We do try and run a program the second Friday of every month at this time that's related to the local history of the greater Central New York area. So I'll make sure you're kept in the loop.
We live in Skaneateles, and so it was very interesting. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes.
We live in Skaneateles, and in the 40s, when we first got our cottage on Skaneateles Lake, the city of Syracuse had a honey bucket truck that came once a week. They provided a pail, and they emptied the pail. It was like an outhouse with a pail, and they would come and empty it. And my mother made sure we were inside when they did that. But the city of Syracuse has been very protective of the watershed from the 1940s and probably before that. But that was when I was aware of the situation, and that was before we had plumbing. We were new on the lake and we didn't have plumbing.
Sure.
Yeah,
they had to be very vigilant. Yes, I've read about those boats there, and I guess that service went on quite until maybe the 60s or quite recently. Yeah.
Yes, especially in the south end of the lake, because you couldn't get a truck down the steep bank so that the boat would go along the shore. But where we were, a truck could come down.
Oh,
we called it the honey bucket truck.
Yes, gosh, it's a service. People don't think of the service, but it's quite a vital service. Yeah.
Yes, it was, and the city has kept the lake clean. That's why the lake is so pure. And the citizens around the lake have an association that is dedicated to keeping the lake pure. So the city is the beneficiary we all are the beneficiary, but the city is because it gets good water.
Yes.
And it is the best. My plants love it.
Yes, a lot of cooperation to make that happen. It's everybody's been very vigilant there. Everybody appreciates. Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. We do have a couple questions here in the chat now. One is from Nancy S. What are still serviced by Skaneateles Water, or is everyone serviced now by Lake Ontario?
Well, it is a little, I think there's a blend in a lot of places, but for the most part, the northern parts of the county, it does come from Ontario. And then I've read that some of the southwestern parts may have Otisco water. And then from what I can understand, Skaneateles still is mostly into the city proper and maybe some of the periphery. But I think Ontario is mainly in those locations on the northern half of the county.
Oh, and we have, how often does the city of Syracuse need to use Lake Ontario water?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably the water department would know that better, but I did read that it's used on occasion when there isn't when there's a need for it. Apparently, I don't know if it's a constant addition to the water supply in the city.
And, oh, this is interesting. Nancy also has a couple questions. The first one is, isn't Lake Ontario fed by Onondaga Lake?
Well, it's fed by a lot of different sources, and it probably, the Oswego River ends up in Ontario, and Ontario has a huge watershed. So yes, it was kind of and that's probably between the engineering needs, and it's something that doesn't flow naturally back to the city. So that's probably why they didn't use it first. The beauty of this Skaneateles location was the gravity feed without needing pumping. But there are pumping stations along the pipeline to bring Ontario water into Onondaga County.
Okay. And her other question is, do you know anything about the springs that Bristol Myers Squibb purchased? It was a spring resort area.
I'm not sure of that one. I know that there were springs in that area. They're not far from Messina Springs, which is just near Thompson Road and James Street there. It's surprising how many springs there were around the city. The ones that they used first were in a little triangular section between the Gertrude, Fountain Street, and Hawley Aves, just up the lower part of James Street Hill. So there were articles that even into the 1940s, there was water flowing in some of the buildings that they were using to cool products. But no, I wasn't aware, and it could be likely because along Thompson Road, you can see that I think there were water tanks along in there that Bristol Myers was using.
Okay.
I believe Baldwinsville's water is mostly from Baldwinsville. It's hard water, but we have our own wells.
Yes,
Oh.
yes. Many of the small towns that developed their own little system. I think Liverpool had its own for a while, and Beeville definitely, yes, would had their own little. There was something like over a dozen that were existing around the time Aqua was formed.
Are there any other questions or comments? Well, if not, I'd like to thank you again for joining us all this morning.